The night sky above the Caribbean was clear, the sea smooth as a mirror. The gentle rhythm of the waves brushed against the hulls of ships scattered across the dark expanse. Merchant convoys moved under minimal escort, confident that these tropical routes were far from the deadly reach of German U-boats. On the horizon, a few faint lights from coastal villages shimmered, and among them, a small fishing vessel drifted quietly, innocent, ordinary, and yet, on this night, fateful. Who could imagine, the narrator's voice begins softly, that the presence of one harmless fishing boat would become the silent key to one of the most devastating attacks of the war? This was early 1942. The Battle of the Atlantic had reached its boiling point. German submarines, U-boats, were pushing deeper into the Western Hemisphere. The Kriegsmarine had given this expansion a chilling name: Operation Paukenschlag, or Operation Drumbeat. Its goal was to strike fear into the Allied supply lines feeding Britain from the Americas. At the center of this operation was U-552, a Type Sevit Sea submarine commanded by Erich Topp. He was only in his mid-20s, but already one of the most feared U-boat commanders in the Atlantic. Topp had a reputation for precision, restraint, and an unnerving calm beneath the surface. His men called him Der Rote Teufel, the Red Devil, for his fiery hair and cold efficiency in combat. By February 1942, U-552 had already become a ghost whispered about in Allied naval rooms. Its attacks were so sudden and coordinated that intelligence officers began to suspect the Germans had tapped into secret shipping codes or somehow received direct reports from coastal observers. The truth, however, was far more subtle and far more chilling. Topp had learned to watch, to observe not only the ships he hunted, but the habits of the people who lived by the sea. From small fishing ports and harbors to lonely boats drifting miles off the coast, every civilian vessel offered him clues. He studied the direction they came from, the times they left harbor, the trails of smoke and sound they carried over the waves. In those movements he found patterns that revealed the invisible arteries of Allied trade. In the weeks leading up to that deadly night, U-552 had been tracking merchant routes near the Caribbean, moving silently beneath the warm waters. The Allies believed these waters to be safe, too shallow for submarines, too distant for German operations. Many of the sailors joked that they were in paradise. They fished off the decks, listened to gramophones, even sunbathed during the day. The war felt thousands of miles away. But deep below, Erich Topp's crew was awake, silent, and waiting. That afternoon, as the sun began to fall behind the horizon, Topp surfaced briefly. Through his periscope, he spotted a small fishing boat about 4 miles off the coast. It was old, wooden, its nets hanging lazily off the stern. 3 men were aboard, laughing, working, oblivious. To them it was just another night in the Caribbean. Yet to Topp, the boat was something else entirely. A signal. He noted its heading, its speed, and most importantly, its timing. Fishermen followed the same currents that merchant convoys used. Their appearance at certain hours often aligned with cargo routes between Trinidad, Curaçao, and the American coast. When the fishing boats appeared, it meant something larger was moving nearby. Topp didn't need spies, he needed patterns. And on that night he had found one. As darkness enveloped the horizon, U-552 sank back beneath the surface. Inside the narrow steel tube, red lights glowed along the control room. The air was heavy, filled with the scent of oil and sweat. Every sound, the creak of a pipe, the faint hum of machinery, echoed through the confined space. The men spoke little. They trusted their captain completely. At exactly 21:47, the sonar operator picked up a faint rumble. Propellers. Several of them. Topp leaned over the chart, his finger tracing a path across the map. The fishing boat had been right. The convoy was coming. Above the waves, the merchant ships sailed unknowingly into the trap. Some carried oil, others ammunition, others food for Allied bases in the Caribbean. None had any idea that death was stalking them from below. The narrator's tone drops lower. In war, sometimes intelligence doesn't come from spies or intercepted codes. Sometimes it comes from watching the habits of the innocent. U-552 turned slowly to intercept. The sea around it was black and silent. Only the faint sound of the diesel engines and the steady breathing of the crew broke the stillness. Topp adjusted his cap, eyes fixed on the gauges. "Prepare torpedoes 1 through 5, he said calmly. The order echoed down the narrow corridor. 5 torpedoes, 5 targets, and one night that would enter the dark history of naval warfare. The small fishing boat, long vanished into the shadows, had no idea what it had set in motion, and as midnight approached, the Caribbean would ignite. The clock in the control room marked a few minutes past midnight. Inside U-552, every man was at his station. The soft glow of red lamps washed over their faces, highlighting the tension in their eyes. Outside, the Caribbean seemed endless and still, but the silence was deceptive. On the surface, 5 merchant ships were cutting through the dark, their engines echoing faintly through the water. Commander Erich Topp stood beside the periscope, his posture calm, but his mind racing. He had tracked convoys before, but never this far south, never in waters this warm and deceptively peaceful. Through the periscope he could see faint outlines, 1 tanker leading, a freighter trailing, and 3 cargo ships in between. They moved in loose formation with barely any escort. The Allied command believed no U-boat could reach this far undetected. They were wrong. "Range," Topp whispered. 2,000 meters and closing, replied the officer of the watch. "Perfect," Topp murmured, lowering the periscope. "We wait another minute." Around him the submarine seemed alive. Pistons sighed, pressure valves hissed, and the crew waited for orders with rigid discipline. Each man knew his task, each breath synchronized with the slow pulse of the engines. Topp leaned against the metal wall, eyes fixed on the clock. His plan was simple but deadly. Strike fast, sow confusion, and disappear before dawn. At 007, Topp raised the periscope again. The nearest freighter loomed larger now, its navigation lights faint but visible. The ship carried crude oil bound for Allied bases in Trinidad, a critical resource for the war effort. He could even make out a few men on deck, laughing, smoking, unaware that death watched them from beneath their feet. "Open torpedo tubes 1 and 2, he ordered. Metal clanked. The crew moved silently, trained to efficiency. Bearing 045 degrees. Depth 1.5 meters. Fire 1. The submarine lurched slightly as compressed air expelled the first torpedo. A heartbeat later, another. Fire 2. Topp held his breath. He didn't need binoculars to know what would happen next. 40 seconds later, a blinding flash lit the dark sea. The shockwave rippled through the water, shaking the hull of U-552. The freighter erupted into flames, its midsection split open like paper. Men screamed, running across the deck as fuel ignited. Another torpedo struck moments later, sending debris and burning oil across the waves. Inside the submarine, no one cheered. Silence filled the control room. They had seen this before, heard the distant cries, the rumble of explosions that followed. It was victory, yes, but a grim one. Topp turned sharply. "Reload tubes 1 and 2, prepare 3 and 4. He wasn't finished. Above, the convoy was in chaos. Ships turned in panic, searchlights cutting through the night, desperate to locate an invisible enemy. Some began firing into the dark sea, their shells landing nowhere. The small escort vessel, an armed trawler, rushed to the burning wreckage, unaware that it was next. U-552 turned starboard. Topp gave the order. Periscope depth, target, escort vessel, bearing 090. He watched as the trawler approached the wreck, rescuing sailors from the water. His voice was cold and precise. Fire 3. The torpedo streaked toward the surface, leaving behind a faint silver trail. Seconds later, another explosion thundered across the sea. The escort's bow lifted violently before vanishing into a column of water and fire. The sea glowed red and orange from the burning oil that spread across the surface. Bodies, debris, and lifeboats drifted amid the flames. Still, Topp didn't celebrate. He simply adjusted his position, eyes locked on the remaining targets. The tanker and 2 cargo ships were still moving, trying to escape in different directions. But U-552 was faster. At 0233, he launched the 4th torpedo. It hit a cargo ship's stern, breaking it apart. The vessel tilted, its propellers rising above the waves before sliding beneath the surface with a roar that could be heard miles away. "Surface," Topp commanded suddenly. The crew hesitated. Surfacing in the middle of an attack was madness, but Topp had a reason. The last ship, a massive oil tanker, was burning from the first explosion. It was already doomed. Surfacing would allow them to recharge batteries and reposition before dawn. The U-boat broke the surface quietly, the hatch opening to the humid night air. Topp climbed up, the wind whipping his face. The sea around him was chaos. 3 ships aflame, 1 sinking, another drifting powerless. The stench of burning oil filled the air. He could see lifeboats moving among the wreckage, men shouting for help. For a brief moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, almost to himself, he muttered, "This is not victory, only mathematics." Down below, his officers recorded the positions, times, and probable tonnage lost. The total would later astonish Berlin. 5 ships in a single night, over 30,000 tons destroyed. But Topp knew what the reports would never capture. The haunting glow of the fires on the water, the reflection of human desperation in the flames, and the thought that it had all begun with a single fishing boat drifting peacefully just hours earlier. As dawn approached, U-552 turned west, vanishing into the deep blue, leaving behind nothing but smoke and silence. Yet somewhere along the coast, word of the attack spread fast. The fishermen who had gone out that night returned to shore at sunrise and saw the black horizon. One of them, an old man with a weathered face, whispered to his son, "Those weren't storms we saw last night. They were ships dying." He didn't know that his small boat, his innocent presence at sea, had unknowingly pointed the hunter toward its prey. And in the days that followed, Allied intelligence would begin asking the same question. How had a single U-boat found a convoy in a supposedly safe zone? The answer would take months to uncover. But by then, the Red Devil had already vanished beneath another sea. The news of the attack spread like wildfire across the Caribbean. Radio stations broke their usual broadcasts to announce that 5 Allied merchant ships had been sunk overnight in what was supposed to be one of the safest maritime zones in the hemisphere. The headlines the next morning called it the Night of Fire. At first, Allied command refused to believe it. Their own reports from the region had long indicated that no German submarine could possibly operate there without refueling or resupplying. It was too far, too shallow, and too heavily patrolled. But the survivors' testimonies were undeniable. They described torpedoes emerging from nowhere, the burning sea, and a single predator that struck with terrifying precision. What no one yet realized was that the U-552 had been guided not by spies or stolen maps, but by a network of innocent eyes. Commander Erich Topp had perfected something few understood at the time, reading the rhythms of human behavior at sea. The fishermen, traders, and small transport captains who roamed the Caribbean weren't his enemies. They were his unwitting informants. Each boat he saw told him a story: which routes were busy, which harbors were active, and where large convoys were likely to pass. He didn't need to intercept radio transmissions when the ocean itself spoke its own language. Days after the attack, U-552 remained hidden far beneath the surface, recharging quietly during the night and submerging before dawn. The men were exhausted but alert, aware that their success had drawn attention. They knew that Allied patrols would soon sweep the region, hunting for the Red Devil. Inside the cramped submarine, tension filled the stale air. The smell of oil, metal, and sweat was overwhelming. Men moved silently through narrow corridors, careful not to waste oxygen or energy. Meals were cold, water was rationed, and the constant pressure of the deep weighed on everyone. But their captain remained composed, calm, methodical, and eerily confident. Topp gathered his officers around the chart table. A dim red light illuminated their faces. On the map, he drew small circles: fishing harbors, supply docks, and isolated coastal villages. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice low but firm, "the British think we rely on luck. They think we appear from nowhere, but we don't. The sea tells us where to strike." One of his lieutenants frowned. "You mean the fishing boats?" Topp nodded. "They know the sea better than anyone. They follow the currents, the winds, and the same trade routes as our targets. Watch them long enough, and they show you everything." He paused, glancing at the map again. "We'll move north tonight. There's a convoy forming near Martinique. We won't attack, but we'll observe. Every move they make teaches us more." For hours, U-552 drifted silently below the waves, engines idling, waiting. Above them, life at sea went on as usual. Fishing boats moved across the surface, their lanterns flickering like distant stars. Topp watched their shadows through the periscope, noting headings, speeds, and intervals. Each one confirmed his theory. It wasn't espionage, it was observation. The ocean was a living map, and its smallest inhabitants were its guides. Meanwhile, in Allied headquarters at Port of Spain, Trinidad, confusion turned to panic. Survivors from the attack arrived shaken and burned, their accounts inconsistent but terrifying. Naval officers gathered around tables piled with charts and reports. How could a U-boat have slipped through patrol lines and struck 5 ships in such rapid succession? Some suspected local collaboration, others a leak in the intelligence network. But no one thought to blame the fishermen, the very people who supplied them with food, repaired their nets, and helped stranded sailors. And so, while Allied ships expanded their patrols, they unknowingly created even more predictable routes. Convoys were ordered to move in tighter formations and along narrower corridors deemed safer. To Topp, this was a gift. By tightening their defenses, they had drawn brighter lines on his invisible map. One night, as U-552 lingered near the surface, the sonar operator detected distant propeller sounds, steady, rhythmic, mechanical. A convoy again. Topp leaned toward the sound room listening. It was faint but unmistakable. Same frequency as before, the operator said. Merchant pattern. Bearing, Topp asked. 215, roughly 15 miles away. Topp's eyes narrowed. That's the corridor between Barbados and Trinidad. They've changed the schedule but not the route. He smiled slightly. Not out of cruelty, but out of the satisfaction of understanding the logic of the sea. U-552 began to move again, gliding through the deep like a shadow. Its hull creaked softly under pressure, the water around it dark and endless. The men whispered prayers, rubbed lucky charms, and checked the gauges obsessively. Each minute underwater stretched into eternity. Above them, the convoy passed unknowingly, its lights dimmed to avoid attention. The faint scent of oil and fuel drifted down from the surface. Topp didn't attack this time. He was patient. He wanted to learn. His plan had changed. He would not merely strike at random, he would shape fear itself. By monitoring local traffic, recording the movement of fishing boats and merchant vessels, he was building a pattern that no intelligence officer could predict. Every sighting, every sonar echo, every conversation overheard on the wireless painted a clearer picture of Allied operations. When U-552 finally surfaced again, the sky was painted in crimson and gold. The sun rose over calm waters, indifferent to the destruction hidden below. On the horizon, a small fishing boat appeared again. Different crew, same type. It drifted lazily, its sails catching the wind. Topp watched through his binoculars and muttered, "The ocean keeps no secrets, only patterns." His officers said nothing, but they understood. Every innocent boat was a signal, every movement a clue. And before the Allies realized it, Topp would use those clues to strike again, farther, faster and deadlier than before. By mid-March 1942, the Caribbean had transformed from a tranquil paradise into a theater of fear. Merchant captains now sailed with their lights off, engines muffled and eyes fixed on the black horizon. Rumors spread faster than official orders. Sailors whispered that the Germans could see through the sea itself, that the Red Devil didn't hunt by sight or sound, but by some sixth sense born of the ocean. In truth, that sixth sense was the mind of Erich Topp, a man who had learned to read the sea like others read a newspaper. For weeks, U-552 had disappeared from Allied radar. Anti-submarine patrols searched the routes around Trinidad, Curaçao and Martinique, but found nothing. Planes dropped depth charges at random. Destroyers combed the waves. Each explosion thundered through the deep like the wrath of gods, yet U-552 remained unscathed, far beneath them, silent and still. Inside the submarine, time had lost its shape. The men spoke in whispers, ate in silence and moved carefully to conserve oxygen. Condensation dripped from the ceiling. The air was heavy with carbon dioxide and diesel fumes. Every creak of the hull reminded them how fragile their world was, just a thin wall of steel separating life from the crushing depths. Topp sat alone in his quarters, studying the new chart. His pencil moved slowly, connecting tiny dots, harbors, currents, and fishing areas. Each mark represented a place where small civilian vessels had been sighted. He had begun to realize something deeper. The fishermen weren't just helping him find convoys, they were the convoy's shadow. Their routes mirrored trade flows perfectly, because they fished where commerce thrived. The Allies didn't realize they had created a living system of signals visible to anyone patient enough to observe. In that realization, Topp found his next target. He called his first officer, Lieutenant Weber, into the cramped room. "Weber," he said, tapping the map, "see this line of villages along the Venezuelan coast? Notice how every 2 days a cluster of fishing boats appears, then vanishes westward by nightfall." Weber nodded. "Yes, sir. We thought they were locals, moving for the catch." "They are," Topp replied, "but not only that. They are following the same routes as the tankers moving north. It's rhythm, Weber, rhythm of the sea." If we move parallel to their path, we'll intersect the convoy without needing a single radio signal. The officer frowned. You mean we follow the fishermen? Topp smiled faintly. Exactly. Let the innocent lead us to the guilty. That night, U-552 rose to periscope depth. Through the narrow lens, Topp spotted several flickering lanterns on the horizon, tiny dots swaying with the waves. Fishing boats. He ordered the engines to match their course, maintaining a discreet distance. For hours, the submarine shadowed them in total silence. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. While the fishermen drifted naturally with the currents, U-552 remained hidden below, using their unknowing movements as camouflage. To the Allies' sonar operators, the faint echoes on the water appeared to be ordinary civilian activity, the perfect cover. By midnight, the sonar picked up heavier propellers, deep, steady, mechanical. A new convoy. Topp's prediction had been flawless. The crew sprang into motion. Orders rippled through the steel corridor. Torpedo tubes 1 through 4 ready. Bearing set. Depth 1.5 meters. But this time, something was different. The Allied convoy wasn't defenseless anymore. Above the surface, a destroyer patrolled ahead of the merchant ships, sweeping the area with sonar. Every few minutes, it released depth charges into the water, explosions booming like thunder across the deep. Inside U-552, the pressure gauges trembled. Dust fell from the ceiling. The men clenched their teeth, holding onto rails as the submarine rocked under the shockwaves. Topp stood still, eyes fixed on the instruments. "Hold depth," he whispered. "Do not surface." The destroyer passed directly above them, its engines a terrifying growl. Another explosion ripped through the water, shaking the hull. Lights flickered. Pipes hissed. A valve burst near the aft section, spraying steam. "Damage, sir!" someone shouted. "Seal it," Topp commanded calmly. Minutes felt like hours. The destroyer continued dropping charges in random intervals, trying to flush out the predator. Each blast came closer than the last. One explosion slammed into the submarine's side, sending men sprawling to the floor. But Topp didn't flinch. He waited. He knew that panic was deadlier than any weapon. Finally, the rumble faded. The destroyer had moved on, convinced the U-boat was gone. Slowly, Topp ordered the submarine to ascend to periscope depth once more. When the periscope broke the surface, the sea was dark and calm again. The fishermen's lanterns had vanished, replaced by faint silhouettes of cargo ships. The hunt resumed. At 01:15, U-552 fired 2 torpedoes in perfect sequence. Seconds later, explosions rolled across the ocean. Flames erupted from a freighter's deck, illuminating the waves in hellish orange. Another torpedo struck a tanker, splitting it in 2. Through the periscope, Topp watched the burning wrecks drift apart. The reflection of the fire danced in his eyes. He whispered, almost to himself, "And again, the ocean speaks." The crew exhaled, trembling from exhaustion and relief. They knew what this meant. Another victory. Another night etched into the grim logbook of the Kriegsmarine. But they also knew what it cost. The crushing silence, the endless pressure, the ghosts that followed them through every patrol. As dawn approached, U-552 dove deep once more. The sea above them burned, and the sky began to pale. Meanwhile, far away in a British intelligence office in Bermuda, analysts pored over new reports. One officer pointed at the map, frustrated. "These attacks make no sense. Every route we secure becomes their next target. It's as if the enemy knows our exact movements before we make them." Another officer leaned closer. "Maybe they're not watching us directly. Maybe they're watching something else." His theory would soon reach London, and when it did, it would reveal one of the most subtle intelligence failures of the entire war. But by then, U-552 had already vanished again, gliding toward deeper waters, guided not by radar but by the faint, invisible rhythm of the human sea. By April 1942, Allied command finally understood what had gone wrong. Reports from multiple regions showed an unsettling pattern. U-boats were appearing in areas thought impossible to reach, near harbors, trade routes, and coastal passages that had been declared safe. But when analysts overlaid maps of U-boat attacks with civilian maritime routes, a chilling revelation emerged. Every major attack coincided with areas of dense fishing activity. It wasn't sabotage, nor espionage. It was simple observation, weaponized. The British Admiralty called it Topp's pattern. What they didn't know was that Erich Topp himself had coined a quieter name in his war log, the fisherman's shadow. To him, the fishing boats were ghosts of trade, They followed the same tides, the same currents, and the same invisible highways that the convoys used. Their presence painted a living map of Allied logistics. The realization struck too late. In less than 2 months, U-552 had sunk over a dozen ships across the Caribbean and the North Atlantic. The Allies scrambled to change convoy routes, but the rhythm of commerce couldn't be altered overnight. The oceans had habits, and Topp had learned them all. Deep beneath the waves, U-552 continued its silent patrol. The men were worn down, their faces hollow, eyes sunken from weeks without sunlight. The submarine's air was thick with the smell of oil and metal. Yet, despite exhaustion, morale remained steady. They trusted Topp completely. His composure, his intuition, his strange ability to find targets where no intelligence maps existed. One night, as the submarine surfaced to recharge its batteries, the sea stretched vast and moonlit. The horizon glowed faintly silver. The war felt far away, as if the world above had forgotten them. Topp stood alone on the bridge, the humid air clinging to his uniform. He thought of the fishermen, men who had never fired a weapon, who knew nothing of politics or strategy, yet their simple, predictable lives had guided his steel beast to kill. He wasn't proud of it, but he wasn't ashamed either. For him, war was calculation, not emotion. "Captain," his first officer said from below, "message from headquarters. They call us back to Lorient. Orders to return home." Topp nodded slowly. "Very well. Set course northeast." As the U-boat turned toward the open Atlantic, Topp's gaze lingered on the horizon one last time. The ocean was calm, as if nothing had ever happened. The fires, the screams, the wrecks, all swallowed by silence. He descended the ladder, the hatch closing above him with a metallic clang that echoed through the submarine's corridors. Below deck, the crew prepared for the long journey home. Some hummed quietly, others wrote letters they knew might never reach anyone. The engines roared to life, and once again, the Red Devil vanished beneath the surface. Thousands of miles away, the Caribbean coast tried to return to normal. The fishermen went back to sea, their small boats rocking gently with the waves. But the memory of that fiery night lingered. Some swore they still saw the glow of burning ships far out on the horizon. Others spoke of strange shapes beneath the water, following silently before disappearing into the blue. In the harbors of Trinidad and Curaçao, naval officers warned fishermen to report any sightings of submarines or unusual activity. The fishermen nodded but said little. To them, the ocean had always been a world of shadows. They knew it better than anyone, and feared it more deeply than any admiral ever could. One old fisherman, the same who had seen the fires weeks before, stood on the shore at dawn, nets over his shoulder. His son, barely 12, looked up at him. "Father," the boy asked, "is the war over?" The old man stared at the horizon. "No," he said softly. "It just moved deeper." Meanwhile, in Germany, U-552 was welcomed back as a hero. The Kriegsmarine celebrated Erich Topp as a national symbol, another successful hunter of the Atlantic. He received medals, speeches, and ceremonies, but behind the fanfare, Topp felt uneasy. He wrote in his private log, "Our greatest victories were not born from strength, but from observation. The smallest lives along the coast led us to the largest deaths. I wonder if they ever knew." The war would continue for 3 more brutal years. Topp survived them all, commanding U-boats in dozens of missions before Germany's final collapse. In 1945, he surrendered his vessel quietly, without ceremony. The ocean, his lifelong accomplice, had claimed too much already. Decades later, historians would revisit the records of U-552. They would find detailed notes about the Caribbean patrols, the timing of fishing routes, and the patterns that led to the infamous Night of Fire. Analysts would call it one of the most brilliant and ethically complex tactics of submarine warfare, a masterstroke of intelligence drawn from the innocence of everyday life. But among all those documents, one line would stand out, scribbled in the margin of Topp's diary, almost like a confession. "The ocean never betrayed me. Humanity did, by being predictable." As the narrator's voice fades, the screen darkens. A distant echo of waves fills the silence. Then, faintly, the sound of a fishing boat's engine hums across the water. Ordinary, harmless, eternal. "War," the voice says softly, "is never fought only by those who carry weapons. Sometimes it's carried by those who never knew they were part of it." The sea returns to calm, the horizon glows with dawn, and somewhere in the depths, the Red Devil sleeps.